Forget everything you've been taught about the origins of medicine. We're about to expose the untold scientific genius of ancient African healers whose forgotten techniques demonstrate an understanding of human physiology and natural compounds that will shock you. These weren't mere rituals, they were sophisticated medical systems, far ahead of their time, and their secrets are finally being unearthed. Picture this. It's 3000 BCE in ancient Egypt. A physician carefully examines a patient with a head injury. He doesn't pray to the gods or dance around a fire. Instead, he meticulously documents the patient's symptoms, tests their reflexes, examines their pupils, and prescribes a treatment based on observable evidence. This physician is following protocols from the Edwin Smith Papyrus, one of the world's oldest surgical documents, which describes 48 different surgical cases with a rational, scientific approach that wouldn't seem out of place in a modern medical textbook. But here's what they don't tell you in medical school. This wasn't an isolated case of African medical brilliance. From the forests of West Africa to the savannas of East Africa, from the mountains of Ethiopia to the kingdoms of Great Zimbabwe, African healers developed medical systems so sophisticated that modern scientists are only now beginning to understand their genius. Today, we're going on a journey through time. We're going to explore 7 extraordinary examples of African medical knowledge that challenge everything you thought you knew about the history of medicine. We'll examine antibiotics discovered thousands of years before Fleming, surgical procedures that predated European techniques by centuries, and pharmacological knowledge that modern pharmaceutical companies are racing to patent. The truth has been buried, overlooked, and dismissed for too long, but the evidence is undeniable, and once you see it, you'll never look at the history of medicine the same way again. Let's begin. Our story truly begins in the dense rainforests of West Africa, where traditional healers known as medicine men or traditional doctors weren't just spiritual guides. They were master chemists who understood the complex interactions between hundreds of plant compounds and the human body. Consider the case of Artemisia afra, known locally as African wormwood. For millennia, healers in southern and eastern Africa used this plant to treat fevers, malaria, and respiratory infections. They would carefully prepare infusions, controlling the temperature and steeping time with remarkable precision. Why? Because they understood something that Western medicine is only now confirming. The temperature at which you extract plant compounds dramatically affects which active ingredients you obtain. Recent scientific studies have validated what these healers knew all along. Artemisia afra contains over 60 different bioactive compounds, including artemisinin, which is now the basis for the world's most effective antimalarial drugs. The World Health Organization estimates that artemisinin-based treatments have saved millions of lives. But here's the kicker. African healers were using these compounds effectively for thousands of years before Western scientists discovered them in the 1970s. But malaria treatment is just the beginning. Let's talk about one of the most stunning examples of ancient African pharmaceutical knowledge, the use of Ancestrocladus corupensis, a rare vine from the Cameroonian rainforest. Traditional healers used this plant for various ailments, but Western scientists in the 1990s discovered something extraordinary. This vine produces michelamin B, a compound that showed remarkable effectiveness against HIV in laboratory studies. The healers who used this plant couldn't have known about retroviruses or CD4 cells, yet they empirically discovered that this plant helped with certain immune-related conditions. Their observational skills and willingness to experiment across hundreds of generations led them to a plant that modern science would later identify as containing anti-HIV compounds. Now, think about what this means. These healers didn't have microscopes. They didn't have laboratory equipment. What they had was an extraordinary methodology, careful observation, meticulous record-keeping passed down through oral traditions, and a willingness to experiment across hundreds of generations. They created a living, evolving pharmacopeia that was constantly being tested, refined, and improved. The Yoruba people of West Africa developed a particularly sophisticated system. They categorized over 600 different medicinal plants, each with specific preparation methods, dosages, and applications. They understood synergy. They knew that certain plants worked better in combination. They understood timing. They knew that some plants were more potent at certain times of the year. And they understood individuality. They tailored treatments to specific patients based on their constitution, age, and condition. The Zulu healers of southern Africa took this even further. They developed a classification system for medicinal plants that included categories for wound healing, pain relief, digestive issues, respiratory problems, and mental health conditions. They had protocols for preparing medicines, storing them, and administering them. This wasn't folklore, it was systematic medical practice. And here's something that should humble every modern pharmacologist. Many of these traditional preparations are more effective than isolated compounds. Western medicine tends to isolate single active ingredients, but African healers understood the concept of the entourage effect long before the term was coined. They knew that whole plant preparations often worked better than any single component because the various compounds worked together synergistically. Take the treatment of pain, for example. The African cherry tree, Prunus africana, was used by healers across the continent for various conditions, including prostate health and pain relief. Modern studies have confirmed that the bark contains a complex mixture of compounds, including ferulic acids and sterols, that work together to reduce inflammation and provide pain relief. Pharmaceutical companies now extract these compounds for commercial medications, but the traditional preparation, which preserves all the compounds in their natural ratios, often works just as well or better. The sophistication doesn't end there. African healers understood dosage in ways that would impress modern pharmacists. They knew that the same plant could be healing or harmful depending on the dose. They developed standardized measurements using natural units, like the width of a finger or the volume of a calabash, ensuring consistency across treatments. This wasn't primitive medicine. This was a sophisticated pharmacological system developed through millennia of careful experimentation and observation, and modern science is only now catching up. Now, let's shift gears and talk about something that might surprise you even more. African surgical techniques that were being performed centuries, sometimes millennia, before similar procedures appeared in Europe. In 1879, a British missionary named Robert Felkin witnessed something that shocked the European medical establishment. In what is now Uganda, he observed a Caesarean section performed by traditional Banyoro surgeons. But this wasn't a crude, desperate procedure. It was a sophisticated surgical operation with anesthesia, antiseptic techniques, and precise methodology. Let me paint you the picture of what Felkin documented. The patient was given banana wine to induce intoxication as anesthesia. The surgeon's hands and the patient's abdomen were washed with banana wine, which we now know has antiseptic properties due to its alcohol content. The surgeon made a precise midline incision, carefully avoiding major blood vessels. When bleeding occurred, it was controlled using cauterization with hot irons. After delivering the baby and removing the placenta, the surgeon massaged the uterus to encourage contraction, then carefully sutured the incision using 7 iron spikes as pins, which were later removed. The patient recovered fully. Both mother and child survived. This was 1879, remember. European and American surgeons were still struggling with infection rates and anesthesia techniques. The germ theory of disease was only just gaining acceptance in the West. Yet here, in the heart of Africa, surgeons were performing complex abdominal surgery with antiseptic protocols, effective anesthesia, and successful outcomes. But the Caesarean section isn't even the most remarkable example. Let's talk about trepanation, the surgical procedure of drilling or scraping a hole into the skull. In Kenya, Archaeological evidence shows that the Caesarean people were performing skull surgery as far back as 3000 BCE. And here's the stunning part. Examination of the skulls shows clear evidence of bone regrowth, meaning the patients survived these procedures. Some skulls show multiple trepanation holes at different stages of healing, indicating that patients underwent multiple surgeries throughout their lives. Why were they doing this? The evidence suggests they were treating head injuries, possibly relieving pressure from cranial bleeding or treating fractures. Some scholars believe they were also treating conditions like epilepsy or severe headaches. Whatever the reason, they were opening the skull, performing some intervention, and the patient was surviving. Compare this to Europe, where trepanation was practiced, but with much higher mortality rates until the advent of modern surgical techniques. The African surgeons clearly understood something crucial. They needed to avoid certain areas of the skull where major blood vessels ran, and they needed to control infection. How did they prevent infection? This is where it gets really interesting. If you're fascinated by these forgotten stories of scientific genius and want to see more deep dives into hidden history, do me a favor, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps more people discover these incredible untold stories, and it lets me know you want to see more content like this. Now back to the story of how these ancient surgeons prevented deadly infections. Traditional African surgeons used a variety of antiseptic substances. In many regions, they applied ash from specific plants, which we now know contains compounds with antibacterial properties. In other areas, they used honey, which modern medicine has rediscovered as an effective wound dressing due to its antibacterial properties and ability to promote healing. Some cultures used tree resins and bark extracts that contained natural antibiotics. The sophistication of their understanding is evident in their suture materials as well. In various parts of Africa, surgeons used natural materials like plant fibers, animal sinews, and even certain types of ants. Yes, ants. In some regions, they would allow large ants with powerful jaws to bite across a wound, then twist off the body, leaving the head to act as a natural suture. This technique, observed in multiple African cultures, creates a clean closure with minimal tissue damage. Ethiopian medical practitioners developed particularly advanced surgical techniques. Historical records describe procedures for removing cataracts, treating fractures, and performing amputations. The famous 17th century Ethiopian medical text, the Zena Menfes Kadus, describes surgical procedures with a level of detail that suggests centuries of accumulated knowledge. In West Africa, the Benin Kingdom's medical practitioners were renowned for their ability to treat wounds and perform minor surgical procedures. When European explorers first encountered the kingdom in the 15th century, they were impressed by the health and physical condition of the people, noting the effectiveness of local medical practices. The key point here is that these weren't isolated incidents of surgical success. These were systematic practices passed down through generations with established protocols and techniques. This was genuine surgical medicine developed independently and effectively. Now, here's where things get really mind-blowing. Long before Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch proved the germ theory of disease in the 1860s, African healers demonstrated an understanding of disease transmission that shows remarkable insight. The ancient Egyptians, for instance, had elaborate purification rituals that modern scientists now recognize as effective public health measures. They understood the importance of washing, they avoided certain foods during disease outbreaks, and they isolated sick individuals. While they attributed these practices to spiritual cleanliness, the practical result was effective disease control. But let's move beyond Egypt and look at sub-Saharan Africa, where the evidence is even more compelling. In many West African societies, traditional healers enforced quarantine procedures during epidemics. When smallpox swept through a village, healers would isolate the sick in specific houses, and they would require anyone caring for the sick to follow purification rituals before rejoining the community. These purification rituals, which included washing with specific plant infusions, served as effective decontamination procedures. Even more remarkably, some African societies practiced a form of variolation, an early type of inoculation against smallpox. In parts of West Africa and the Horn of Africa, healers would take material from a smallpox pustule of someone with a mild case and introduce it into the skin of healthy individuals, typically children. This would often result in a mild case of smallpox that conferred immunity. This practice was documented by European observers in the 18th century, but the traditions clearly predated European contact. Some scholars believe variolation was practiced in Africa for centuries before it was introduced to Europe in the 1720s. Think about that. African healers were performing what was essentially vaccination, using empirical observation to recognize that controlled exposure to disease could prevent future illness. The logic is staggering. Without any knowledge of viruses, antibodies, or immune systems, these healers observed that people who survived smallpox never got it again. They recognized that people with mild cases were less likely to die, and they figured out that deliberately causing a mild case could protect against a severe one. That's brilliant empirical science. In Eastern Africa, traditional healers demonstrated sophisticated understanding of disease vectors. In regions where sleeping sickness was endemic, communities would avoid certain areas near water where tsetse flies were prevalent. They recognized the connection between the flies and the disease, even though they couldn't have known about the parasites the flies carried. This kind of epidemiological observation required careful attention to patterns and the courage to draw conclusions from those patterns. The Maasai people of East Africa developed practices that suggest understanding of zoonotic diseases, those that pass between animals and humans. They had elaborate rules about handling sick animals, disposing of carcasses, and avoiding contact with certain animal products during disease outbreaks. These weren't arbitrary taboos, they were effective public health measures based on observed correlations between animal disease and human illness. In Southern Africa, some societies practiced what we might now call contact tracing. During disease outbreaks, healers would try to identify who had been in contact with sick individuals and monitor them for symptoms. This shows a recognition that diseases spread through human contact, a fundamental concept in epidemiology. The sophistication of African disease management is also evident in their understanding of nutrition's role in health. Many societies had specific dietary recommendations for sick individuals, and modern analysis shows these recommendations often provided the exact nutrients needed for recovery. For instance, during fevers, traditional healers would recommend specific soups and gruels that were easy to digest and provided hydration and calories. What's crucial to understand is that all of this knowledge was developed through observation and experimentation. These healers didn't have the scientific framework to explain why their interventions worked, but they observed what worked and what didn't, and they built effective medical practices on those observations. That's the essence of empirical science.
Here's something that modern medicine is only now fully appreciating: the integration of mental and physical health. While Western medicine spent centuries treating the body and mind as separate entities, many African medical traditions understood their interconnection from the beginning. The concept of holistic health, treating the whole person rather than just symptoms, wasn't a New Age invention. It was standard practice in traditional African medicine. Take the Ethiopian medical system, for example. Ethiopian healers recognized what they called kulf siga, which roughly translates to disease of the spirit, but encompassed what we would now call mental illness. Importantly, they understood that these conditions could have both spiritual and physical causes, and they developed treatments that addressed both. They used specific plants known to have psychoactive properties, but they didn't just hand out medicines randomly. They created controlled environments for treatment, what we might now call therapeutic settings. Patients would undergo treatment in calm, quiet spaces, often with music, specific scents from burning incense, and the presence of trusted community members. This is remarkably similar to what modern psychiatry calls set and setting, the recognition that environment and mindset dramatically affect treatment outcomes. The Yoruba people of West Africa had a particularly sophisticated approach to mental health. They recognized different categories of mental illness, from what we might call depression, which they associated with the loss of connection to community and purpose, to what we might call psychosis, which they saw as a disconnection from reality and social norms. Their treatments were multifaceted. Yes, they used medicinal plants, many of which modern science has confirmed contain psychoactive compounds, but they also used what we would now call psychotherapy. Healers would spend time talking with patients, helping them work through problems, reconnect with community, and find meaning and purpose. They understood that mental health often required addressing social and environmental factors, not just prescribing medicine. In many African societies, mental health treatment included what we might now call group therapy or community therapy. The community would gather to support an individual struggling with mental illness, often through ceremonial gatherings that involved music, dance, and communal storytelling. Modern psychology has rediscovered the therapeutic value of these approaches under names like music therapy and community-based mental health care. The recognition of trauma and its treatment is another area where African medicine showed sophistication. In societies that experienced warfare or significant stress, healers developed specific interventions for what we might now call post-traumatic stress. These often involved controlled recollection of traumatic events in safe spaces, not unlike modern trauma-focused therapy. The Zulu people had a concept called ukufa kwabalingiswa, which described an illness caused by suppressing emotions or failing to properly mourn losses. The treatment involved creating space for emotional expression, often through ritualized crying, singing, or talking about the deceased or the traumatic event. This is remarkably similar to modern grief counseling and trauma therapy. What's particularly impressive is the African understanding of psychosomatic illness, the way mental stress manifests as physical symptoms. Traditional healers recognized that anxiety could cause stomach problems, that stress could cause headaches, and that unresolved emotional issues could manifest as chronic pain. They treated these conditions by addressing both the physical symptoms and the underlying emotional causes. The integration of meditation and mindfulness into African healing practices is also noteworthy. In various traditions, healers used controlled breathing, focused attention, and meditative states as part of treatment. These techniques, which Western medicine is now validating as effective treatments for anxiety, depression, and chronic pain, were standard practice in African medicine. Perhaps most importantly, African systems understood the crucial role of social connection in health. They recognized that isolation and disconnection from community could be as harmful as physical disease. Treatments often involved reintegrating individuals into their communities, giving them roles and responsibilities, and ensuring they felt valued and connected. This holistic approach extended to physical health as well. African healers didn't just treat symptoms, they looked for root causes. They asked about diet, sleep, work, relationships, and spiritual well-being. They understood that health was multifactorial, affected by environment, behavior, emotions, and social circumstances. Modern medicine is finally catching up to this wisdom. We now talk about the biopsychosocial model of health, recognizing that biological, psychological, and social factors all interact to affect health outcomes. But this was standard practice in traditional African medicine long before Western medicine developed the vocabulary to describe it.
Now we come to one of the most stunning discoveries in the history of medicine, a finding so remarkable that when scientists first announced it, many people simply didn't believe it. I'm talking about the Nubian antibiotic beer. In the 1980s, anthropologist George Armalogos was studying skeletal remains from ancient Nubia, the region that is now Sudan. What he found changed everything we thought we knew about the history of antibiotics. Examining bones dating from 350 to 550 CE, Armalogos discovered something extraordinary: tetracycline, a powerful antibiotic. And it wasn't just present in one or two individuals, it was present in nearly every skeleton he examined, even in children as young as 4 years old. The concentration was high enough that these people must have been ingesting tetracycline regularly, not occasionally. Initially, the scientific community was skeptical. Antibiotics were discovered by Alexander Fleming in 1928, right? How could ancient Africans have been consuming antibiotics 1,500 years earlier? But the evidence was undeniable. Further investigation revealed the source: beer. The Nubians were brewing beer from grain that had been deliberately contaminated with Streptomyces bacteria, the same bacteria that produced tetracycline. And it wasn't just accidental contamination. The process was consistent and widespread, suggesting it was deliberate. Think about what this means. The Nubians somehow figured out that grains stored in a particular way developed beneficial properties. They incorporated this grain into their beer-making process, and they consumed this beer regularly. The result was a population that was consistently ingesting antibiotics. The health effects were visible in their bones. These Nubian populations showed remarkably low rates of infectious disease compared to other ancient populations. Their bone density was excellent. They lived longer than many of their contemporaries in other regions. The question that haunts researchers is, how did they know? How did they figure out this specific process resulted in health benefits? They couldn't see bacteria, they didn't understand antibiotics, but they observed that people who consumed this specially prepared beer were healthier, and they made it a cultural practice. This is the power of empirical observation carried out across generations. Somewhere in Nubian history, someone noticed that certain beer made people healthier. Maybe people who drank it recovered faster from illnesses. Maybe communities that produced it had lower death rates. Whatever the observation, it was consistent enough that they institutionalized the practice. And the sophistication doesn't end there. Recent research suggests the Nubians may have understood dosage. The concentration of tetracycline in their bones suggests they were consuming it regularly, but not excessively, indicating some understanding that consistent, moderate consumption was beneficial. But the Nubian antibiotics aren't the only example of African antimicrobial sophistication. Across the continent, healers used substances with antibacterial properties. The use of honey in wound care, which we've already mentioned, is widespread. So is the use of certain plant extracts and minerals. In parts of West Africa, healers used clay with remarkable antibacterial properties. Recent analysis has shown these clays contain compounds that kill antibiotic-resistant bacteria, including MRSA. Pharmaceutical researchers are now studying these clays, trying to understand exactly how they work and whether they can be developed into modern medications. The use of fermented foods and probiotics is another area where African medicine showed sophisticated understanding. Many African societies consumed fermented foods like sorghum beer, fermented milk products, and fermented vegetables. Modern science now recognizes that these foods support gut health and boost immune function through their probiotic content. Traditional African medicine also employed what we would now call antimicrobial essential oils. The burning of specific resins and plant materials in living spaces, which was common practice in many societies, served to reduce airborne pathogens. The smoke from these materials contained compounds with antibacterial and antifungal properties. What all of this demonstrates is a sophisticated, empirically driven approach to preventing and treating infections. Without the germ theory of disease, without microscopes or laboratories, African healers developed effective strategies for dealing with microbial threats to health. They did it through careful observation, systematic experimentation, and the accumulation of knowledge across generations. The Nubian antibiotic story in particular should fundamentally change how we think about the history of medicine. This wasn't luck. This wasn't accident. This was the result of a long process of observation, experimentation, and knowledge transmission. It was science as surely as anything done in a modern laboratory.
So where does all this leave us? What are we to make of this overwhelming evidence of African medical sophistication? First, we need to acknowledge a hard truth. This knowledge has been systematically overlooked, dismissed, and erased from the history of medicine.
When European colonizers encountered African medical practices, they often dismissed them as primitive superstition, despite the fact that many of these practices were more effective than contemporary European medicine. This wasn't just cultural prejudice, it was a deliberate erasure. Colonial powers had a vested interest in portraying African societies as backward and in need of European civilization. Acknowledging the sophistication of African medical systems would have undermined that narrative. But the evidence cannot be denied. From the surgical techniques of the Banyoro to the antibiotics of the Nubians, from the pharmacological knowledge of the Yoruba to the mental health treatments of the Ethiopians, African medical systems demonstrated scientific thinking, empirical observation, and effective practice. Modern medicine is finally beginning to acknowledge this heritage. Pharmaceutical companies are racing to study and patent traditional African medicines. Medical researchers are investigating traditional surgical techniques. Psychologists are incorporating traditional African approaches to mental health. In many cases, they're finding that the traditional methods work as well as or better than modern alternatives. But here's what we need to understand. This isn't about romanticizing the past or claiming that traditional medicine was perfect. Every medical system, including modern Western medicine, has limitations and failures. The point is that African medical systems represented genuine scientific endeavor, sophisticated understanding, and effective practice. These healers were working with limited tools and limited theoretical frameworks, but they were doing real science. They observed, they hypothesized, they experimented, they recorded their results, and they built on the knowledge of previous generations. That's the scientific method, even if they didn't call it that. Today, there's a growing movement to reclaim and preserve traditional African medical knowledge. Organizations like the African Traditional Medicine Research Center are documenting traditional practices, testing them scientifically, and working to integrate effective traditional practices into modern healthcare systems. This is crucial work because we're losing this knowledge. As older generations pass away, centuries of accumulated wisdom are disappearing. As modernization spreads, traditional practices are being abandoned before they can be properly studied and validated. But it's not just about preserving old knowledge for historical interest. Many of these traditional medicines and techniques could address current medical challenges. With antibiotic resistance becoming a global crisis, the antimicrobial compounds used in traditional African medicine could offer new solutions. With mental health disorders on the rise worldwide, the holistic, community-based approaches of traditional African medicine could provide alternative treatment models. The story of African medicine is ultimately a story about human ingenuity, about our species' remarkable ability to observe, experiment, and develop effective solutions to health challenges using whatever resources are available. It's a story that belongs to all of humanity, and it's one we need to tell accurately and completely. For too long, the history of medicine has been told as if it began in ancient Greece, moved to Rome, disappeared during the Dark Ages, and was resurrected during the European Renaissance. This narrative ignores the continuous medical traditions that flourished in Africa, Asia, and the Americas throughout human history. The truth is more complex and more interesting. Medicine developed independently in multiple places, with different cultures making unique contributions. African medicine represents one of the oldest and most sophisticated of these traditions, and its contributions to human health have been profound. As we face new health challenges in the 21st century, from pandemic diseases to antibiotic resistance to mental health crises, we would do well to look to the full breadth of human medical knowledge. The ancient African healers, with their sophisticated understanding of plants, their surgical skills, their epidemiological insights, and their holistic approach to health, have much to teach us. Their legacy isn't just historical, it's living. In communities across Africa, traditional healers continue to practice, blend traditional and modern medicine, and serve their communities. Their knowledge, tested across millennia, remains relevant. The story I've told you today is just the beginning.
There are countless other examples of African medical brilliance waiting to be explored, documented, and shared. Every plant in the African Pharmacopeia has a story. Every traditional surgical technique has a history. Every community health practice emerged from generations of careful observation. These stories deserve to be told, not as curiosities or exotic tales, but as legitimate chapters in the history of medicine. The ancient African healers were our ancestors, our teachers, and our pioneers. They mapped the medicinal properties of thousands of plants. They developed surgical techniques that saved lives. They understood disease transmission and mental health. They created antibiotics. They were scientists, even if they would never have used that word. And their legacy is all around us, in the medicines we take, the surgical techniques we use, and the holistic approaches to health we're finally beginning to appreciate. So the next time someone tells you that medicine began in ancient Greece or that scientific thinking is a European invention, remember the Nubian antibiotics, the Banyoro surgeons, the Yoruba pharmacologists, and the countless other African medical innovators whose genius shaped the history of healing. Remember that science isn't owned by any one culture or civilization. It's a human endeavor, emerging wherever humans face challenges and work systematically to solve them. And remember that the untold stories of ancient African medicine aren't just footnotes in history. They're essential chapters in the story of human achievement.
Thank you for joining me on this journey through forgotten history. These stories deserve to be known, to be remembered, and together we can reclaim the narrative of African scientific achievements. If this story changed your perspective, share it. If it surprised you, tell others. And don't forget to like and subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. And remember, the ancient healers cannot speak for themselves anymore, but their work speaks volumes. And now, finally, we're beginning to listen.